Hi everybody, Adam Steele here from Hot Pole Studios, and today we're talking about Reaper, the DAW. In the first part of this series we talked about the basics and how to get to grips with recording audio and MIDI, and in the second part we talked about the inbuilt effects that you can use in Reaper. Now we're going to get into some of the real nitty gritty stuff, and we're going to talk about how to do routing, or routing depending on where you're from, which means how to send a particular sound to another channel and what that can mean and what you can do with that and how it can get quite complicated but really be quite effective. Let's show you all that right now. Before we get into this too deep, I just wanted to say that this show is brought to you by you guys through Patreon. If you check out our Patreon, we are supported entirely by you guys. You guys help us to keep the lights on, as it were, help us to keep filming more stuff like this, and in return we try and give you things like early access to the videos, direct access to us for things like mixing advice, all sorts of things. Check that out, it really helps us out. Thank you once again. So, you can't really talk about routing without talking about effects, because without the entire idea of effects, you don't really need lots in terms of routing. So, if I was to hit play on this project, I've got sounds. So I've got my drums, I've got my guitars, I've got everything. And if I wanted to add effects to these, you'll see I've got a couple of EQs here on the drums and on one of the guitars, and they are inserts. Inserts are the most simple way of thinking about routing, which is to say you've got a sound, you're running it straight through that effect and straight through to the output of that channel. That's nice and simple, but we don't always want to do that. Quite often, we'll want to send a little bit of that audio, or all of that audio, somewhere else. And one of my favourite examples of this is a reverb. So we'll start simple with the send. I did talk about this in the basics, but I'm going to go over this again very briefly. I'm going to make a new channel called Reverb, and I'm going to add the Reverb, helps when you can spell, Reverb 8 plugin over there entirely wet. So that's on a separate channel. So now if I want to send some drums, if I look at the drums on our edit window, I can see that there's this tiny little button that's got route on it. I can click that and that will bring up the routing menu. Alternatively, if I'm on the mixer window, just to show you this, then there's the routing button here as well. If I click that, it brings up the same window. Now that everything is set as usual, and we'll talk about this very quickly, but for sends, I can add a new send. I can find the name of the track that I want, or the number of the track that I want, which in this case is reverb, and click that, and that will then send the drums through to the reverb. So if I solo the drums, you can now see in the mix window that the drums have got sound and the reverb has got sound. If I was to solo just the reverb, we'll hear that. And that's just reverb. Now, why would I want to do that? This is very important. Why would I want to have the reverb separately? There are so many reasons, but the main reason for me is, what if I wanted to send some of the guitars to the same reverb? What if I wanted to send some of a vocal to the same reverb? That makes life easy, because then I've got one reverb separately that's on a send, and also then if I change anything in that reverb, that affects all the channels all at once. The other reason is now I can do things like, I've got this reverb here. What if I want to add an EQ after that reverb to take out all the low end, maybe all the high end, just on the reverb, and not screw up the sound of the drums or anything else that I'm sending to it? That will now become, say, a real if I want to radio effect the drums or really push the mids, but only on the reverb, and have those drums as they were without being affected, you can now hear that that reverb's really quite mid-focused. I might not want to do that in a mix, but there are so many options. I can do things like, I could distort that, I could compress it, I could do anything with that reverb before or after the reverb on that insert right there, and that doesn't affect everything else that I'm doing. That can be really quite a useful thing to do. Now, that's sends and inserts. Here's another thing that may be useful for you. Now this send has a level here. If we bring up that routing, in fact, let's bring up the routing page again, because that's all just there, but if I click on that separate reverb, we only get this little bit, so it's not taking up the entire space of the screen. And we can see that there's a volume here of how much we want to send. We can actually pan the amount of the drums that are going to that reverb separately without changing the pan on the drums. Now, here is a drop down that's very important where it says post fader, post pan. If I turn down the drums and then turn them up, that affects the reverb as well. And that's because that send is currently set as post fader. If I do a drop down here, I can make it pre-fader, but post effects, which means that the drums will go through this EQ with that little notch that's in there for whatever reason. Then, if I change the amount of drums that we're hearing, it doesn't change how much is going to the reverb. They're then completely separate. Sometimes you do want that, because that then means that you can have separate controls so that you can have separate tracks that don't get affected. And depending on your workflow, that can be really useful. And also, before that was pre-effects, so you can actually send the raw audio out from a channel to another channel and also have all the effects on that channel, so you're not copying and doubling and tripling channels. This is something I do a lot with something like, I don't know, a bass. But I'm going to do it with the drums here. Let's do this. So here's something that I do quite often. Let's just get rid of that reverb and just make a new channel underneath drums. I keep missing the control. So, let's just say, let's compress these drums really, really, really hard. Okay, so those drums are now being compressed really hard, but what I can do is I've made a new track called Drums Clean. If I now find my routing window, I can send the drums to that Drums Clean, and I can do it pre-effects, which means that I now get another channel with the original drums with no compression or anything on them, without having to undo all the work that I've already done on the original channel. So you can have a really complicated setup on a channel, and if you then decide you need the original sound somewhere else, I don't then have to copy and paste all the audio files. I can just have a send. And that also for me is a benefit, because then if I edit the audio, because I've not copied and pasted them, I'm not having to do that over and over and over. I still have the freedom to edit things once and still have all these copies of the track that are going on separately. That can make workflows a lot easier. So now I've got a clean drums and a distorted drums, and they're running completely separately of each other, which means that I can have a really easy way of doing that. You can also use this for, I've every now and again done things like had a vocal go to a reverb but without compression, so that as the singer gets really loud, you get more reverb or that kind of thing. But that doesn't affect the heavy compression that's already on the main vocal in the track. That's really quite an effective thing. And it's just about in your mind where the cable comes from in the routing and where it goes. Much like on an analog mixing desk where you are patching things in from. It's just a case of in your mind going, well, I want the sound to go from here to here before that happens. The next thing I'm going to talk about here is sending something out to an external effect. Let's say you've got a separate outboard compressor or outboard EQ. You want to send sound to that. Or even something like a separate headphone mix, let's say, that you don't want to use your master output. You want to send that so you've got a different balance somewhere else. What you would want to do there, let's bring up the mix window again. Let's use the routing on this guitar right here and open this up. So the first thing we have is the master send, which is sending the audio from this channel through to the master, which is what we tend to hear. We tend to hear the master coming through the speakers. But then right at the bottom, there's audio hardware outputs. This isn't the same as sends in Reaper. This is physically going to send the audio out of a channel on something like the Sono. So for us at the moment, analog 1 and analog 2 are the master outputs. But if we send this out for analog 3 out, the analog hardware, I've now got a choice of how much volume I want to send to that. If I was sending that to a compressor, for example, I might want that to be pre-fader so that when I'm changing the level of what I'm hearing in Reaper, it's not affecting how the compressor works. But that will then just get sent out and do its thing. If I then wanted to, I could then have a new track that's got record armed and then treat that as a new source coming in. That's one way to do that, if that's what you want to do. Or if you're running live sound this way, you can send several different tracks out of different outputs. So you could have the bass coming out of one output, the guitar coming out of another, so that your guy who's doing the mixing live has control over everything separately. I've seen that done quite a few times. However, I tend to find that if you're working and you actually want something like, you know, an outboard compressor as an insert, so you want to send the sound out to this outboard compressor, then bring it back. It's a real hassle to have a separate channel with a separate record and all that kind of stuff, delay compensation. So that's where a plugin called Reinsert comes in. Reinsert is amazing because what Reinsert does, I can decide here by bringing this up, this will then send this audio out through the outputs that I choose. So I can go analog 3 and 4 or anything like that. I can send MIDI out. If I've got MIDI outputs and I've got a MIDI track, I can then send that. And then I've got hardware returns, so I can choose what channel it comes back in for. And there's automatic device latency adjustment, so it knows that there's going to be some latency in the audio interface, because there always is. It's not always much, but this means that it's automatically going to make sure that it comes in perfectly in time. And then I can change the amount of volume going to it and coming back from it, and I don't need to then record anything or have any really complicated routing. This one plugin will mean that my vintage analog equipment will then be treated like a plugin. For me, that's great because it means that the routing is really simple and I get to use classic gear. Instead of sending audio, I could just say non and send out of a MIDI channel to something like my Yamaha DX7 keyboard and then use the hardware returns for that. So if I've got a MIDI channel that's been played in here, I can have, by using Reinsert, I can send the MIDI out, have latency compensation, all that kind of stuff, so that when I hit go, it will just start playing the DX7 into that channel and treat it like that. And then you can freeze or render that track, which we'll talk about in another video, to then keep that permanently, if that's what you need to do. At this point, I'm going to talk about gating a little bit because it's something I didn't talk about in the previous episode about effects. Because gating I wanted to talk about in combination with routing, because half the time I find that a gate is really something that is routing dependent. So I'm going to use... Firstly, I'm going to try a gate on the drums, because then that should be quite easy to talk about. So I'm not going to talk about this for too long because I want to talk about the routing part of this more than anything. So if I bring up a gate, it's got an infinite threshold right now, so anytime it's not going to do anything. But let's say we only wanted the hits of those drums to come through, that buh-da, buh-da. When we hit play, you can see the green there bouncing up and down on those snare and kick hits. So if we bring our threshold up to there and then hit play and listen for it, we'll hear it start to kick in around there and cut out the sound when it's not loud enough to get past that. Okay, so you can hear that threshold on the gate. When the sound goes above that, we get sound. So the release is how quickly it closes the gate again, which can make it more natural. The attack is actually the opposite of a compressor. It's kind of how slowly it opens up. If you're too quick with an attack on a gate, it can sound strangely clicky. Hold is once it's triggered, how long it just stays open, which can be quite a useful thing. You can do clever things like you can use this on a reverb to give that big 80s feel with that doof, doof, doof kind of thing. You can also use the low pass and high pass here, which actually just, they don't change the sound of what you're doing, they change what the gate's listening for in terms of what you want it to use to open that gate. If you've got a really heavy kick drum but there's a load of cymbals going on, you probably don't want the cymbals to open the gate, so you tune this so that just the low part of that kick drum, that bo, 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 is making the gate open. Similarly, you can do that with any other kind of drum or anything else where you don't want rumble to open the gate, you don't want cymbally wash to open a gate. That can make it nice and clean. If we use the preview filter output tick box, that'll show us exactly what it's listening for as well. Cool. So that's one way of using a gate, but now we get into the idea of routing. So let's say we want a gate on these guitars, but let's say, I mean this is a bit crazy, but let's say that in this case we want that bum ba dum bum dum bum, but for the guitars. So the guitars will go gung 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 based on when the drums hit. There are times that you might want to do something like this, especially in electronic music. So let's set up this on the guitars. So it's never going to be affected by the drums unless we somehow use the drums as what you might call a key or an auxiliary input, because a gate has a detector, and the detector is literally the bit that detects when the gate should be open or closed. You can either send this guitar, you can send its own signal to the detector, or you can use something else with the detector. How do we do that? Routing. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at this drums channel, and we're going to add another send, but this is where it gets clever. We're going to add a send to our channel for guitars, which was channel 3. Guitar 1 mic's old normal, it's a silly name. But here's where we get clever. Underneath that send it says audio 1 and 2 going to audio 1 and 2, and we don't want that. We want the audio 1 and 2, which is the stereo of the drums, to go to some new channels on the guitar track. Let's say 3 and 4, because we're not going to hear those. So if we hit play, you'll see on the mixer now, you can actually see the guitars coming through fine, but then also there's an extra 2 channels where the drums are pumping. And what we want to do is go back to regate now, and you can see it says 4 in, 2 out at the top, because the 4 in, now this guitar, if we look at the routing for this, it says the track channels, it now has 4 channels, left and right, and then extra ones that we're not hearing, and it's got a receive to 3 and 4. And regate is a plugin that has 4 inputs. So we want to change our detector input to auxiliary input. And that means that now if we preview filter output, that is now what's making the gate move, so that. Now that sounds really weird to me, but let's bring it in with the drums. Cool, so that's sidechaining compression. Now, a lot of the time I see this done in mixes, especially in electronic music, the opposite way round, where the kick drum, and usually it's the bass, are kept opposite of each other so that when the kick drum hits, the bass doesn't play. Now, the way that you do that, we're almost there here. We're going to change our gate. We're going to add the dry signal in, which is the original sound of the guitars, so that they're both playing, and then we're going to hit this button that says invert gate duck, because ducking is what we want. So the wet and dry are now completely opposite of each other, so when they're both playing at full volume, they actually cancel out. So this should now do the exact opposite effect. It's making me a little seasick there, but the idea is that the signal that's hitting the gate is making it go the other way and only close the gate when there's enough signal from the original. So you'll actually hear, especially on synths and bass on house music, you'll hear that whoop, 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 whoop. That's using a gate in this way so that you can then have that nice and timed. At this point, we need to talk about grouping, because one of the ways that I make mixing simple for myself, and one of the ways that a lot of guys, especially in the analog world, make things simple for themselves, is they will mix into groups or buses, depending on the way that, terminology, it's the same thing. So let's say you've got 4 guitars. You might do a little bit of separate EQ or whatever on those guitars, but then when it comes to a full mix, you will tend to have a guitars bus. So you'll have a group or a bus, whatever you want to call it, that is just a fader or a stereo pair of faders that do just that. It's most common with drums, because let's say you've got 20 channels of drum microphones. You don't want to be leaning over that trying to change the volume of all of it. You want to send all of that to somewhere that's just a stereo group where you can just make that more or less. You can compress or EQ the whole thing together. You can do that as simple, separate things that clear the mind and make mixing so much easier for you. That's something I do on every mix that I do because it makes my life simple. There are two ways to do it. There's the traditional way, which is using sends to make groups, or there's the way that I tend to do it, which is the more modern way, which is folders. So let's talk firstly about the more traditional way, which is sends. The guitars are a really good example here. So, like I've said before, Reaper doesn't have group or bus tracks and audio tracks and instrument tracks, and it just has tracks. Much like an analog desk just has inputs and outputs and channels. That's how Reaper works. It is simple in that way. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at routing. The first thing we're going to want to do if we want a guitar group or a guitar bus is we're going to need a track to be that bus, to be the group. So I'm going to make a new track and I'm going to move it over so that it's kind of close to what we're doing, but it could be anywhere. And I personally tend to have my groups right at the end, much like an analog mixer would do. I tend to have them all together. But let's call this guitar bus. And I'm doing it in capital letters just for my own peace of mind so that I can see it. I tend to find that capitals stand out for me. And so if I hit play, that won't do anything. Because those three channels of guitars haven't been told to go anywhere other than the master output. So let's solo one of these guitars and look at the routing. So the routing, if I hit play, so the routing for this is going out of the master. So if we want it to go out of a group, we probably don't want it to go out of the master as well. Although we could, if that's what we want to do for some reason. If I untick this master send, the faders will still go, but we won't hear it because it's not coming straight out of the master. Now, this is where routing can get a little complicated and you've got to think about it all in your mind. So now we want to send this to the guitar bus, and that will come through the guitar bus. So the reason we're now hearing it is because even though it's not coming out of the master send, it's going to the guitar bus, and the guitar bus is coming out of the master send. So if we look at the routing for this guitar bus, the master send is ticked here, and instead of send, and instead of the send on the left, we see a receive on the right, because everything that sends has a receive inside of Reaper. Hardware sends, you get to choose, but if you're sending something in Reaper, it has to be going somewhere, and that receive is right here. So that's now coming through and through the master send. I'm going to do the same with both of these other guitars. I'm going to untick the master send, send it through the guitar bus, and the same with the guitar solo. So that's all coming through. Now, if we unsolo it all and hit play, it all sounds exactly the same as it did before. The key difference is if I solo this guitar bus channel now, that's all coming through there, which means I now have a separate volume slider for all of the guitars together. And also I can now send that entire guitar bus to somewhere like a reverb, so I'm not having to do it individually, so I've then got a much more broad control. I can have effects, like let's say there's an EQ that I want, just on all of the guitars. So if I... So if I want a treble boost, say, on all of the guitars at once, that's now done just once, and I don't have to change it every separate time. I find this quite useful with something like drums, where I might want to use compression on all of the drums all at once. By having them going through a group or bus, that then gives me a stereo set of drums to work with without taking away the fact that I can still balance and affect the separate drum channels if it turns out that the balance wasn't right or something needed changing there. In this way, I tend to find that my mixes at the end have a drum bus, bass, rhythm guitars, lead guitars, acoustic guitars, main vocals, backing vocals, effects, and maybe synths. So in less than 10 channels then, I can have a really complicated song with over 100 channels going on. And once each individual one is edited and balanced and that kind of thing, I'm only concentrating on those 9 or 10 channels at the end. And it makes thinking about it so much easier. Now for the more modern way of doing it that I find works really well for me. This is something I actually learnt from Cubase, but then was implemented in Reaper, and it's something I use a lot, and that is folders. So, again, if I make a new track and call it, I don't know, guitar folder, I will find that this makes life simple. So I've gone back to the routing of having the separate guitars coming back out of the master send, so everything we just did has been reset back to normal. So if I make a guitar folder channel, the first thing that I have to do is make the guitar folder channel on this window, on the edit window, be above the other channels that I want. And then what I have to do is I have to shift and click all the channels that I want to be in this folder and then drag them up, and you'll see a blue line appear. And when that blue line just shifts in slightly underneath where it says guitar folder, I let go, and you'll see how these 3 tracks have now kind of gone indented a little bit. So now that's changed things. It's not changed the sound as with the old group busing method, but you'll see now that there's kind of a shadow has appeared of the waveforms combined. And if I solo the guitar folder, that's now all coming through that folder. And then we can do things like we can use sends from the folder, we can use effects on that folder like we did with the traditional bus method. Now, why is it more useful like this? It's more useful because, technically speaking, each of the separate tracks is still coming out of the master send, which means that even though it's kind of cascaded through a folder, if I want to do something clever like rendering out separate stems, because it's coming out of a master send, we can get a nice clean file of that. It's something that saves a lot of hassle. And one of my favourite little tricks, if I right click on where it says master here, there is a button that I like to tick that says clickable icon for folder tracks to show and hide children. Now what that does is this tiny little arrow appears here on the guitar folder. And if I click that, all the other guitars that were in that folder have now been hidden. Now, what that means is if I've got 20 tracks of drums or 30 tracks of drums, I can shrink that down into one. So in terms of clarity of mind, I can do that to all my different groups. So I just see drums, bass, guitars. And on one page, I can have 100 and something channel mix, and I can just see the groups. And then if I need to at any point, I can then pop them back open and adjust something, pop them closed again. And that's not affected anything audio-wise. That's just a visual thing for me that really makes life simple. I use this a lot as a really good example. If I'm recording heavy guitars, I might have 3 microphones on a guitar cab. Maybe a room mic, close mic, a different close mic. And then let's say that I've got that twice, left and right, and then I'm quad tracking it left and right. That's 12 channels of guitar. That's a lot of guitar. But what I can do is I can put all of those microphones for one take of guitar into a folder. I can then have each set of guitar microphones in their own subfolder, and then I can collapse it all. And once the editing's done, in terms of mixing, that makes my life so much easier because I can collapse 12 guitar channels into just 4 guitar takes, and then I can collapse them into one guitar folder if I'm just doing overall tonal shaping. And that just means that everything's nice and easy for peace of mind. It means that I don't have to then render anything, collapse anything down. Reaper's powerful enough to play that many WAV files without a sweat, so I may as well not, slam things down. If it turns out later on that one of those microphones I decided I didn't like, or something like that, I can dive in, change the balance, collapse it all again, and it saved me so much time because I'm not having to root through old versions of projects. Everything's still there. And with folders as well, this down arrow is on the edit window, and I can click that a couple of times to shrink everything down. So it's all still there, but it's taking up minimum screen space, which especially on smaller screens or with really complex kind of setups, like say if you've got 20 channels of drums and you want to see when the drums stop and start, but you don't need to see the details of 20 channels of drums, you can pop them open, pop them closed again. If I zoom in a little bit, I can have it so I can see all these takes, and then if I click this once, it shrinks them down. Click them again, it shrinks it right down. So I can very quickly start opening and closing things without having to dive into subfolders or anything like that, without having to have anything hidden. It makes life nice and fast. There's one more thing that I want to talk about in terms of routing today, and that is monitor effects. Something that I've been using quite a lot recently is SonarWorks. SonarWorks is a really good plugin and hardware solution that I use that can either correct the way that my headphones are working or correct the way that the speakers interact with the room. Even though my room's fairly well treated here, it's just that extra last little bit. It's not installed on this computer, but I'm going to use an EQ to demonstrate a very similar thing. So if I open up the mixer and if I bring in an EQ on the master track, then if I was to say I needed less low mids, more highs, whatever, the point will stand either way. If that was to correct what I was hearing, that's great. But when I go to then bounce or render or finish the track, that will be on there, and if I forget to take that off, then that will actually affect negatively the way that that's presented to anybody else, and that's not ideal. So what you can do now is, if I just get rid of that, if we go to View, Monitoring Effects, I can have anything in the monitor effects, and now I've clicked something. You see in the top right now, there's a green monitor effects button. So I could have less low mid, more high mids, and that will only affect what comes out of the speakers and out of the headphones. It won't affect when you hit render or bounce. It will not be on there by default because it's a monitoring thing. The routing is actually after the master output, which is really useful because then I can affect what I'm hearing so that I've got a more balanced mix, but it won't affect what I send to other people. Also, if it turns out that you need to turn off that monitoring effect just to make sure that you're not going crazy, where it says monitoring effect, there's a tiny little standby switch. If we click that, it goes red, and the monitoring effects are then bypassed until you turn that back on, which means that you can check that things are right. Or say you've been listening on headphones on a laptop, you just want to check how a mix sounds on laptop speakers, for example. Pull out the headphones, turn off the monitoring effect so that anything that was affecting the headphones doesn't also affect the laptop speakers. I mean, it's probably not the best way to check a mix, but it's something I've seen people do just for a sanity check. It means that you've got a much more leveled, balanced way of doing things if it's not specific to your exact monitoring environment. And so that concludes this tutorial about routing. There is a little more that we're going to do, but we're going to wait until after the next episode, which is about external effects. Because we're going to talk about third-party effects, instruments, because you can now, as well as all the stuff we've shown you in Reaper, we're going to start bringing in outside influences, outside manufacturers' own sounds and wonderful things that I use on a day-to-day basis and really use Reaper as a vehicle for. So then we're going to talk about routing specifically for things like a full virtual drum kit, where if you want each separate drum to come out of its own channel, that's routing, but we're going to actually talk about external effects themselves, then talk about that routing. So there's a lot to go at. I hope this has been really useful for you, not just kind of an aimless ramble. So stick around for the rest of the series and everything else that we do, because we do gear reviews, we do comparisons of other gear. So stick around for all that kind of stuff. I'm Adam Steele, this is Hot Pulse Studios. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Goodbye.
Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this, feel free to check out our other videos, as you can find here, or check out our Facebook and Twitter, or our Patreon page, which helps us to make more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.